This is our surprise guest this evening. Ken is our local historian, living historian, former chair of the Waterloo region for many years, and a former mayor of Woolwich Township. So Ken is going to give us some of the history about the discussions of amalgamation and provide us with certain grounding and foundation. So Ken, loud and proud, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
This isn't the history of amalgamation because wasn't really part of the talks, but I'm going to try and get through it because I've got a fair bit of material to cover. So I'm going to read. I apologize for that, but I want to cover the territory. So you asked me to provide some background to regional reform efforts over the years. So I've attempted to pull together a brief history. Of course, there's much more I could tell, but today I will simply try to set the stage. My more recent work on reviewing the regions of Ontario is covered with a non-disclosure agreement. So for now, I'm unable to speak about the report, except that it was thoroughly researched and well documented and carried recommendations which would have seen, in my own opinion, a much more robust municipal system than we currently have in place across much of Ontario. I must say that when I went back to review some of the many boxes I left in the archives, I was somewhat astounded at how much material there was and how much I had forgotten. But one thing was sure, self-generated reform was virtually impossible during those years, except for one time when two services, garbage collection and transit, moved to the region in an effort to help by some of the municipalities to ward off the problems from intervening. What I will attempt to do is give you some of the efforts for you to better understand that finding a local solution or approach has been spectacularly unsuccessful in the past. Waterloo County came into being in 1853. Berlin became the county seat where the courthouse and jail were built. The courthouse was built in 1853, and then it was demolished and replaced with one in the 1960s. There it is. That was the courthouse. That's the painting that was made of it. And the next slide shows the courthouse, which is still next to the court there, and was built in 1964. The original county included every township and town in the county at that time. Eventually, Kitchener, Galt, and Waterloo separated in 1915, 1918, and 1948, respectively. Although they still did some things jointly with the county, such as the Homes for the Aged, and in the 1960s, an area-wide planning board. By the late 1960s, rapid growth in Southern Ontario led the province to look to reforming the old counties and separated cities in high-growth areas. Metro Toronto had been created in the 1950s, and the model was looked to as a method to create regional governments in some areas. There was support for such an approach by many in Waterloo, and Stuart Fife was sent to make recommendations on restructuring the county and the three cities. He came up with two possible schemes, one of which became the basis for the new region, and they're just on here briefly, and they're hard to see on the screen. I apologize for that. One which would have seen two cities, a southern city and a unified northern city surrounded by 4 townships. And then a second scheme, which would be the next slide, which had 7 municipalities, not just like dissimilar to what we have today. And I just heard this, and this was really interesting. The county council today came up with a different scheme, and they divided into divisions, which had basically one centralized city, and then a number of smaller cities around the side, which would have seen, interestingly enough, Escler being part of a rural municipality to the north, and then parts of Cambridge. It would be interesting to see what that would have been produced today's politics had that scheme gone forward. One can only speculate what would have happened. So the next map is really, the next slide is really what materialized out of that, the 7 municipalities we have to today. After the first few years of operations after 1973, many of the new regions were reviewed to give the opposition in some quarters, given the opposition that there were some that existed in some areas. William Palmer carried out a review, which was tabled in 1979, which essentially confirmed that the new system was working and made some minor suggestions for change. It's interesting to note that little came of the review except to tell people it was here to stay. In 1990 and 1991, the Liberal and then NDP governments proposed to undertake some further review of regions. One example the Liberal government had put forward was that the 2-tier sewer and water systems in the early regions had been a terrible mistake and should have been 1-tier systems, as was done in the regions that were created after 1973. However, nothing came of these. The Liberal government was defeated, you'll recall, and nothing really came of these efforts, despite the reports following the Walkerton inquiry. In 1993, I attended a conference of Canadian and American cities and regions hosted by Gardner Church, a former deputy minister, which spoke about the need for better consolidated municipalities in order to compete economically in the competitive world and in the North American marketplace and in the international marketplace. The economic troubles of the 1990s created intense pressure for greater and more focused, cohesive economic development. It led me to begin to look more closely at our local municipal structures. Although there were many efforts over the next 2 years, I'd highlight a few. In 1993, the regional chair and the mayors worked to begin a review of local services and governance. John Sweeney was appointed to carry out a local review done by a local person. At the time, I wrote, and I had forgotten I'd written this, but I did, the result should not be a one-tier government, but a finely tuned and responsive two-tier system that could deliver. John Sweeney's work began in 1994, and over the next 2 years, he undertook work on the review. John decided to retire from the review in 1995, but produced reports on the first two topics, which recommended one-tier sewer and water and direct elections for the regional chair and regional council. Regional council then decided in 1996 to form a working group on local governance reform. David Lease chaired that group to carry on the work and hopefully to find some local consensus on reform issues. However, this work did not produce any results either, came to no conclusions. Two editorials in the latter part of 1996 summed up the state of reform. I'm just quoting from them. Regional councillors are incapable of reform was one heading on another, while another later was titled Region is frozen by glacial indecision. From 1994 to 1997, nothing was accomplished other than the direct election of the regional chair. The election of the Harris government gave some hope to reformers. Toronto was amalgamated and the municipalities were getting messages to get something done. It was in the late 1990s that an effort to keep the province at bay, transit and garbage collection were given up to the region by the area municipalities. And I'll speak to that later. The failure of any other substantive changes had put the region on the province's radar. In 1999, they were prepared to act, and it was common knowledge that Waterloo was on the top of the list to see some action. However, the day of the announcement saw commissioners sent into Ottawa, Hamilton, Chatham-Kent, and Sudbury. Waterloo was nowhere to be found on the A list, but was on the B list with instructions to get something done or the province might intervene. This was a shock to many, but it was later learned that there had been a last-minute political intervention to take Waterloo off the A list. Subsequently, the province did intervene, but only to reduce the size of regional council and all councils and to provide for the direct election of the regional councillors other than the mayors. Efforts subsequently to find local reforms all failed, including facilitation, which ultimately failed, which should be a lesson to somebody. This was a newspaper headline that followed some of that work that was going on. An approach to the province for commissioner was stalled with a last-minute plea from a local regional councillor for one last facilitated effort. Michael Follett, who some who are listening may have known, a local consultant and he's well respected, led this last facilitated effort. It ended up containing a single-tier sewer and water system and potential for the region to assume the Senator Square, but not much more. It ultimately failed to get a triple majority. Mike Harris stepped down, and Ernie Eves, the new premier, wanted to settle things down for a coming provincial election. So he sent his municipal affairs minister out to the region to shut down any hint of provincial action and effectively ended all efforts at local municipal reform. At the risk of being drawn into the debate, which I don't intend to do tonight at any rate, I want to include by offering a comment garnered from my many years involved in this question. During these discussions locally and elsewhere, the question was always status quo, service rationalization, or amalgamation in the context of reducing costs of government and or better and improved service delivery. Those arguing for the status quo always argued the cost would not go down, but go up. And service improvements got very little attention by opponents. However, a review of what actually transpired painted a different picture. In Waterloo Region, when garbage and transit were moved to the region, the first region-wide tender for garbage collection gave Cambridge improved and expanded garbage collection services at a lower cost. The late 1990s had seen Cambridge reducing its transit program to offset tax increases. The regional takeover saw the restoration and expansion of Cambridge Transit in the early years funded at a regional level. All of this is well documented in the various reports table of council can be found by anybody who wants to take a look at the reports. In the amalgamated cities, there were cost savings immediately, some of which were documented in various reports. However, at the same time as the amalgamation took place, the Harris government undertook a massive transfer of responsibilities, now referred to as service realignment, but more commonly known as downloading. The government claimed these shifts were revenue neutral as they took over some of the school taxes. However, only two municipalities, Peel and York, came out as winners. The rest of the regions took hits. In the case of Waterloo Region, the hit was $14 million, which had to be absorbed annually in the regional tax levy. Newly amalgamated cities such as Toronto and Chatham-Kent were able to use their amalgamation savings to cover off these shortfalls. The government of the day never undertook a study of amalgamation savings, in my opinion, as they would have shown that the service and taxation changes they made were not revenue neutral as they claimed. So my advice is twofold. In any discussion, look to the real experience. Cost savings, which were real, and improved service to people. All of these, which by past experience were actually real. There's much more I could say, but we'll stop there and let others take over. In today's world, regional reform is even more important than ever. I don't believe the status quo is the recipe for the future health of this. And that's my.
Yeah. Okay. Ken, thank you very much. And I won't ask you any questions because I know you have a non-disclosure agreement that you're under. So I appreciate you coming on and taking the time to provide us with the background information that you did. It's clear that local discussions have always been very difficult, and not a lot maybe has been achieved as one would have hoped through those local discussions. But thank you very much for providing that information. And I note in that last newspaper clipping, there was reference that person, whoever wrote that story, and I think it came out of the Elmira paper, said something like the province needs to send in a facilitator to try to achieve some change. So
she had her terminology mixed up. I would say my non-disclosure agreement, we'll see when the province announces its next steps, whether I engage in what goes on or not. But right now I'm covered by that agreement. And depending what comes from out of the province the next little while, I may or may not have more to say.
Okay. Well, that's, there's news. We'll stay tuned on that. So thanks a lot, Ken.